I had known for 3 weeks that my neighbour was watching my every move, but while he was watching me, I was also preparing a plan he never expected, and Saturday morning everything was going to begin. My name is Alexander Kane, 42 years old, senior architect at Meridian Design Group in Portland, Oregon. For 8 years I had been living in quiet Oakwood Hills, where the biggest drama usually involved someone forgetting their trash bins on collection day. That peaceful existence changed when Robert Chen moved into the house next door. Robert seemed friendly enough initially. Late 30s, worked in tech, recently divorced from what he described as a controlling wife. The problem started about a month after he settled in, when I noticed his new security camera was pointed directly at my backyard. At first, I thought it was an oversight. Security cameras sometimes capture neighbouring properties accidentally, and I figured a polite conversation would resolve things. I was completely wrong about Robert being a reasonable person. The camera had a clear view of my entire backyard, my wooden deck, and even some of my kitchen windows. Every morning when I had coffee on the deck, every evening when I grilled dinner, every weekend when I worked in my garden, that camera was recording everything in what should have been the privacy of my own property. I decided to approach Robert directly. One Saturday morning, I walked over and knocked on his front door. He answered wearing a Stanford University sweatshirt and holding a mug of what smelled like expensive imported coffee. "Robert," I said in my most friendly neighbour voice, "I wanted to discuss your security camera. The one mounted on your back porch appears to be pointing directly at my backyard." He took a slow sip of his coffee and looked at me with what I can only describe as mild amusement. "Yeah," he said casually. "What about it?" "Well," I continued, maintaining my diplomatic approach, "it captures my entire backyard and some of my windows. I was hoping we could adjust the angle so it focuses on your property instead." Robert set his expensive mug down on a small decorative table next to his door and crossed his arms. "Look, Alexander," he said, using my name in a way that felt oddly condescending. "My camera points wherever I need it to point. If you do not want to be recorded, maybe do not go outside." This was clearly not about security for him. This was about power, about asserting some kind of dominance over his new neighborhood. Some people get genuine pleasure from making others uncomfortable, and Robert Chen was definitely one of those people. "I will look into my legal options," I said finally, keeping my tone measured. "You do that," he replied with a smirk that I wanted to wipe off his face. "Good luck with that process." Walking back to my house, I realized Robert Chen had made a significant miscalculation about who he was dealing with. He assumed I was just another suburban homeowner who would complain for a while, then eventually give up. He had no idea what I was capable of when someone pushed me too far. That night, I sat in my home office researching local privacy laws and homeowner rights. What I found was both encouraging and frustrating. While I did have legal protections against being recorded on my own property, the process of enforcing those protections would be lengthy, expensive, and uncertain. But Robert had made one crucial mistake in his assessment of the situation. He thought I was some ordinary guy who would eventually back down. He had no idea that my architecture career had given me very specific skills in planning, design, and systematic problem solving. More importantly, he did not know anything about my background before I became an architect. Before I started designing buildings, I had spent 6 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, specializing in surveillance and reconnaissance systems. I knew about surveillance, counter-surveillance, and how to approach problems that required both patience and precision. Robert Chen was about to learn that some people become much more dangerous when they take their time and plan very carefully. Over the next few days, I began paying closer attention to Robert's behavior patterns. My military background had taught me to gather intelligence before making moves. What I discovered was both revealing and disturbing. Robert worked from home most days, which explained why he had time to monitor my activities. I noticed he would position himself at his kitchen window whenever I went outside, sometimes holding coffee, sometimes just watching. It was creepy and deliberate. The camera was a high-end model, probably worth around $1,500. It had night vision, motion detection, and could rotate to follow movement. This was not basic security. This was surveillance equipment being used to invade my privacy systematically. I decided to test my theory. On Wednesday evening, I deliberately spent extra time in my backyard, watering plants and organizing my tool shed. Sure enough, Robert appeared at his window within minutes. When I waved at him friendly, he quickly stepped back and disappeared. That evening, I called my friend Marcus Webb, who worked in cybersecurity for a major tech company in Seattle. Marcus and I had served together in the army, and he specialized in digital surveillance and counter-surveillance techniques. "Alexander," Marcus said after I explained the situation, "this guy sounds like a classic control freak. The expensive camera, the deliberate positioning, the refusal to adjust when you ask politely. He is getting psychological satisfaction from violating your privacy." "What would you do?" I asked. "First," Marcus replied, "document everything. Take photos of the camera angle. Record dates and times when you notice him watching you. Save any communications. If this escalates, you will want evidence." "What about technical solutions?" I asked. "Well," Marcus said with a chuckle, "there are definitely ways to make his surveillance hobby less enjoyable. But officially, I cannot recommend anything that might interfere with his equipment." I understood what Marcus was not saying directly. There were legal ways to protect my privacy, and there were more creative approaches. The next morning, I visited the local police station to file a formal complaint. Officer Janet Morrison listened to my concerns with professional attention. "This is more common than you might think," Officer Morrison explained. "The challenge is that privacy laws can be complicated when the camera is technically on the person's own property." "We can document your complaint officially," she said. "We can also send an officer to speak with your neighbor about adjusting the camera angle." 2 days later, Officer Morrison visited Robert's house. I watched from my kitchen window as they had what appeared to be a 15-minute conversation. Robert was animated, gesturing frequently, and at one point he pointed directly at my house. After the officers left, I received a text from an unknown number. "You called the cops on me." "Really? This is just the beginning." I saved the text and added it to the growing file about Robert's behavior. His response told me everything I needed to know. Instead of being reasonable, he was doubling down on his aggressive approach. That evening, I noticed Robert had installed a second camera. This one pointed even more directly at my backyard. He had also added bright LED spotlights that activated whenever there was motion in my yard. The message was clear. He was prepared to escalate further, but Robert Chen had made a fundamental error. He thought intimidation and technological harassment would make me back down. He had no idea that his behavior was actually providing me with valuable intelligence about his methods, his equipment, and most importantly, his weaknesses. I spent that weekend developing what I privately called Operation Privacy Shield. The plan had multiple phases, each designed to address different aspects of Robert's invasion. Some elements would be completely legal, others would require more creative interpretation of local regulations. By Sunday night, I had filled an entire notebook with observations, plans, and contingencies. Robert Chen wanted to play games with surveillance and intimidation. What he did not realize was that he had just challenged someone who had been trained by the United States Army to win exactly these kinds of games. Monday morning would mark the beginning of Robert's education. Monday morning arrived with crisp autumn air. I had my coffee on the deck as usual, maintaining my normal routine while Robert's cameras recorded my every move. What he did not know was that starting today, I would be recording his moves as well. Phase 1 of Operation Privacy Shield began with intelligence gathering enhancement. Over the weekend, I had installed my own discrete surveillance system, consisting of 4 small cameras positioned strategically around my property. Unlike Robert's obvious setup, mine were nearly invisible. The cameras were military-grade equipment I had acquired through a contact from my army days. They offered full-spectrum recording, including infrared capabilities that could capture clear footage even in complete darkness. More importantly, they were focused entirely on Robert's property, documenting his behavior patterns. My first discovery came within hours. Robert was not just watching me casually. He was conducting systematic surveillance, taking photographs with a telephoto lens whenever I appeared in my backyard. He had also been documenting my daily schedule. This was stalking. I spent Monday afternoon researching Robert Chen more thoroughly. Using my architectural firm's database access and connections from my military service, I began building a comprehensive profile. What I found was disturbing and useful. Robert had a history of conflicts with previous neighbors. In his last neighborhood in San Francisco, he had been involved in 3 separate disputes over privacy and property boundaries. One had resulted in a restraining order being filed against him by a woman who claimed he had been watching her through her windows. He also had financial problems. Despite working in tech and living in an expensive neighborhood, Robert was behind on his mortgage payments and had defaulted on 2 credit cards in the past 18 months. His recent divorce had been costly. This information gave me valuable insight into Robert's psychology. He was someone who felt powerless in many areas of his life, and controlling his neighbors gave him a sense of authority he could not find elsewhere. Understanding this made it easier to predict his reactions. Tuesday evening, I implemented phase 2 of my operation. Using a technique Marcus had suggested, I began what intelligence professionals call electronic countermeasures. Robert's cameras relied on wireless signals to transmit data to his recording devices. Those signals could be disrupted. I set up a signal jamming device in my basement, positioned to interfere with the wireless frequencies Robert's cameras used. The device was completely legal, operating within Federal Communications Commission guidelines. It would not damage his cameras permanently, but it would make them significantly less reliable. The results were immediate and satisfying. By Wednesday morning, Robert was outside examining his cameras, clearly frustrated that they kept losing signal. I watched from my kitchen window as he adjusted antennas, checked connections, and eventually called technical support. Around noon, a van from a security company arrived. 2 technicians spent 3 hours troubleshooting his system, testing equipment, and trying to identify the interference source. They eventually left without solving the problem, and I could see Robert arguing with them in his driveway. That evening, Robert knocked on my door. When I answered, his usually smug demeanor was replaced by obvious frustration and suspicion. Alexander, he said without greeting, have you noticed any problems with wireless signals in the neighborhood lately? I maintained a perfectly neutral expression. Problems how? I asked. Electronic interference, network issues, that sort of thing, he replied, studying my face for any sign of guilt. I shook my head. My internet and phone service have been working fine. Is there something specific you are concerned about? Robert hesitated, clearly wanting to accuse me directly but lacking proof. My security system has been experiencing technical difficulties, he said finally. I am sorry to hear that, I replied with convincing sympathy. Technology can be so unreliable sometimes. The frustration in Robert's eyes was unmistakable. Yes, he said through gritted teeth. After Robert left, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. Phase 2 was working exactly as planned. His surveillance hobby was becoming significantly less enjoyable, and he was beginning to understand that someone else could play technological games just as effectively. But this was just the beginning. Robert had escalated by installing additional cameras and spotlights after the police visit. He had made it clear he had no intention of backing down. That meant it was time to move to phase 3. Thursday morning, I made a call to my lawyer. Patricia Walsh, who specialized in privacy law. Patricia had been recommended by a colleague at my architectural firm. Alexander, Patricia said after I explained the situation, you have documented everything beautifully. The evidence of Robert's escalating behavior creates a pattern any judge would find concerning. What are my legal options? I asked. We can file for a restraining order based on stalking behavior. We can also pursue a civil lawsuit for invasion of privacy and harassment. Let me draft a formal cease and desist letter, Patricia said. This will put Robert on official legal notice. If he continues, it strengthens our case significantly. I agreed to Patricia's approach, but Thursday evening, Robert provided me with an opportunity I had not expected. Around 7 o'clock, I noticed unusual activity at Robert's house. A woman I had never seen before was carrying boxes from a car into his front door. She appeared to be in her early 30s, blonde, and was clearly moving belongings into the house. From their body language, they were romantically involved. This was interesting. Robert had told everyone he was recently divorced and living alone. If this woman was living in the house, she was also being recorded by Robert's surveillance system, whether she knew it or not. Using one of my discreet cameras, I captured clear footage of the woman and her license plate number. A quick online search revealed her name was Jennifer Mills, and she worked as a marketing coordinator in downtown Portland. Friday morning brought an unexpected turn. Around 9 o'clock, I noticed Jennifer in Robert's backyard, clearly upset and arguing with him. From my kitchen window, I could see her gesturing angrily at his cameras. 30 minutes later, Jennifer knocked on my front door. When I answered, I could see she had been crying. "Are you Alexander?" she asked. "Yes," I replied. "Can I help you?" "I am Jennifer Mills," she said. "I'm staying with Robert next door. I need to talk to you about his cameras." I invited Jennifer inside and offered her coffee. As we sat in my living room, she began to explain. "I had no idea about any of this until this morning," Jennifer said. "Robert told me his security cameras were just for protection, but I found out he has been recording you and probably other neighbors without permission." Jennifer pulled out her phone and showed me several video files. They were recordings from Robert's cameras, showing me in my backyard on various dates. But what was more disturbing was that some recordings also showed Jennifer herself, captured without her knowledge or consent. "He has hours of footage of both of us," Jennifer said. I had no idea I was being recorded. When I asked him to delete the recordings of me, he refused. This was exactly the evidence I needed. Jennifer was clearly upset about being recorded without consent, and her willingness to share the video files indicated she might testify against Robert. "Jennifer," I said carefully, "Robert has been harassing me for weeks. I have documented his behaviour and filed police reports. If you are comfortable with it, I would like to put you in touch with my lawyer." Jennifer nodded immediately. "Yes, please. I feel violated and angry. I trusted Robert, and he has been secretly recording me without my permission." I called Patricia Walsh immediately and arranged for Jennifer to meet with her that afternoon. Within hours, my legal situation had dramatically improved. Instead of being a single complainant, I now had a witness who could testify that Robert was systematically recording people without consent. Friday evening, Patricia called with an update. "Jennifer's testimony changes everything," she said. "We now have clear evidence that Robert is using surveillance equipment to violate multiple people's privacy. Monday morning, we file for an emergency restraining order and preliminary injunction requiring Robert to immediately stop all surveillance activities. With Jennifer's testimony and your documentation, I am confident we will get the order." Saturday morning, I noticed that Robert's cameras had been removed. For the first time in weeks, I was able to enjoy my backyard without being watched. Sunday evening, I received a text from the same unknown number. "This is not over. You have turned my girlfriend against me, but you have not won yet." I saved the text and forwarded it to Patricia immediately. Robert's threatening behaviour would only strengthen our case. Monday morning would bring justice. Monday morning arrived with clarity. I dressed in my best suit and drove to the county courthouse, where Patricia Walsh was waiting with a comprehensive legal filing that would finally end Robert Chen's harassment campaign. The emergency hearing was scheduled for 10 o'clock. Patricia had worked through the weekend to prepare our case, compiling all evidence along with Jennifer's testimony and video proof of Robert's systematic privacy violations. When we arrived, Jennifer was already there, looking nervous but determined. Robert arrived with a lawyer I did not recognize, a young man who looked like he specialized in corporate law rather than privacy disputes. Robert himself looked haggard and angry, clearly not expecting the legal situation to escalate this far. The hearing was remarkably straightforward. Judge Margaret Coleman listened carefully as Patricia presented our case. The evidence was overwhelming, and Jennifer's testimony about being recorded without consent made Robert's behaviour impossible to defend. Robert's lawyer attempted to argue that the cameras were positioned on Robert's own property and that any recording of neighbouring areas was incidental. Judge Coleman was not impressed, especially when Patricia showed the court Robert's text messages threatening continued escalation. The most damaging moment for Robert came when Patricia played one of the video files Jennifer had provided. It showed Robert deliberately adjusting his camera to get a better view of my backyard, clearly demonstrating that the surveillance was intentional and systematic. After less than an hour of testimony, Judge Coleman issued her ruling. Robert was ordered to immediately remove all surveillance equipment pointed toward the neighbouring properties, delete all existing recordings of myself and Jennifer, and cease any further surveillance activities. She also granted a 6-month restraining order. Judge Coleman also ordered Robert to pay for both my legal fees and Jennifer's counselling expenses, noting that his behaviour constituted intentional infliction of emotional distress. The total financial penalty came to nearly $8,000. As we left the courthouse, Robert made one final mistake. Instead of accepting the court's ruling gracefully, he approached me in the parking lot and began shouting about how I had ruined his life. He was clearly agitated, making threats about what he would do when the restraining order expired. Unfortunately for Robert, Jennifer was recording the entire interaction on her phone, and Patricia was standing close enough to serve as a witness. Within 24 hours, we were back in court with additional evidence of Robert violating the restraining order. Judge Coleman extended the restraining order to 2 years. 2 weeks after the final court hearing, I noticed a moving truck at Robert's house. Jennifer had moved out immediately after the first court hearing, and Robert had apparently decided that staying in the neighborhood was no longer tenable. The new neighbors who moved in 3 months later were a retired couple named Frank and Eleanor Patterson. They were quiet, respectful people who introduced themselves politely and never showed any interest in surveilling their neighbors. 6 months after Robert moved away, I received a letter from Jennifer. She had moved to a different part of Portland and was seeing a counselor. She thanked me for encouraging her to speak up and for connecting her with Patricia Walsh. As I read Jennifer's letter, I reflected on the lessons learned. Robert Chen had made the fundamental mistake of assuming that escalation and intimidation would solve his problems. Instead of addressing his own insecurities, he had chosen to project them onto his neighbors. The military had taught me that the best battles are won through preparation, patience, and strategic thinking, rather than aggression and emotion. Robert had never learned this lesson, and it cost him his home, his relationship, and his reputation. A year later, I still lived in the same house in Oakwood Hills, enjoying my privacy and my good relationship with the Patterson family. My backyard was once again a place of peace, where I could have my morning coffee and relax without feeling watched. Sometimes I wondered what might have happened if Robert had simply responded to my initial, polite request by adjusting his camera angle. The entire conflict could have been avoided with a 5-minute conversation. Instead, his need to assert dominance had led to consequences that followed him across the country. As I sat on my deck that autumn evening, exactly 1 year after the conflict had begun, I raised my coffee mug in a quiet toast to the power of preparation, the importance of good neighbors, and the satisfaction that comes from knowing that justice finds its way to those patient enough to pursue it properly.